Florida, I always felt somewhat smothered, or at least underwhelmed. And as my studies continued and my understanding matured a little bit, I began to realize why. I was being trained to think like Immanuel Kant. This is a critique of pure reason here, and I'm sure all of you have this by your bedside for light reading in the evenings. But in all seriousness, even if you haven't read a single word of it, Kant is inside of your mind because he's had a profoundly deep influence on our culture. And I think this is important to pay attention to because philosophers don't just reflect on the world. They participate in the making of history. The young Alexander the Great, for example, was schooled by Aristotle. And Marx learned everything he knows about history from Hegel. So the reason I bring up Kant is because the way we think and the way we speak makes and unmakes worlds. And for Kant, questions about God and about God's relationship to humanity and the cosmos, while Kant would certainly agree they're of the utmost importance, he nonetheless said that they were beyond the philosopher's ability to know. But if my 2 years at PCC have taught me anything, it's that this artificial separation between the human heart-mind and divine wisdom is not only unnecessary, it's a symptom of the sickness of soul responsible for our planetary predicament. So I want to speak as a lover of wisdom about the place of God and religion in the emerging social imaginary we call the ecosotic era. I think ecology has rightly become the rallying cry of our increasingly illumined planetary consciousness. But I don't think this necessarily means that theology, or perhaps better, theosophy, can be retired. The word theology seems to imply some sort of over-masculinized attempt to intellectualize the divine. So I think theosophy suits my purposes better because it suggests patiently listening for rather than logically hunting down the meaning of the divine. And it also seems clear to me that traditional religion, the word derives from the Latin religare, which means to bind fast, and which implies sort of being bound to the dogmas of the past. I think this traditional sort of religion may no longer serve us. But in the ever-present origin, John Gebser speaks of what he calls preligion, which is the further flowering of religion out of its deficient mental mode of mere belief, so as to allow, quote, a genuine eruption of the other side into this side, the presence of the beyond in the here and now, of death in life, of the transcendent in the immanent, of the divine in the human, end quote. So preligion, in this sense, may make real what for traditional religion remained merely ideal. I'd like to speak on behalf of this possibility. But I want to pause for a moment to acknowledge some pressing questions which I imagine may be in some of your minds. Whether it be called religion or preligion, it's really just another spin on the same old Judeo-Christian story, right? And what's the use of reviving theology when it seems that our real problems are ecological? And isn't our scientific understanding of the living and evolving cosmos enough to inspire us? I must admit that I am going to speak the language of a particular book, the Bible. But I also think it's a mistake to only notice the differences between the world's major religious traditions. There really does seem to be a perennial wisdom informing the esoteric teachings of every tradition, even if this wisdom reveals itself differently according to the needs of particular places at particular times. All human beings have spiritual aspirations, which means that an understanding of time and evolution are not enough to satisfy the infinite longing of our souls. I think psychic wholeness requires that we also have some sense of eternity and of involution. All the world's spiritual traditions seem to me to be in agreement about this. There's no doubt in my mind, though, that theology or theosophy cannot continue to remain relevant if it fails to pay attention to the significance of time and evolution. That is, to the significance of Earth. As Teilhard writes, it used to appear that only two attitudes were possible for humanity, either loving heaven or loving Earth. With a new view of space-time, a third road opens up, to make our way to heaven through the Earth. End quote. It's from Christianity and Evolution. So natural science has learned quite a bit in the last 200 years about the natural history of our planet. What you see on the screen here is an Earth clock. So if we imagine that the 4.6 billion years of our Earth's history were condensed into an hour, the first simple cells would have emerged within less than 10 minutes. So what this tells me is that life was no mistake, and that clearly the Earth was never a mere rock, but was potentially living from the very first moment it began folding upon itself in space-time. This, along with our knowledge of the common origin of all life, and of all matter, energy, and space-time, is a testament to the interconnectedness and creativity assumed to be absent from nature by earlier scientific paradigms. I don't, however, think that the recognition of this imminent creativity makes talk of alpha and omega superfluous. In fact, I think it makes these theological concepts more relevant than ever, because modern science is suggesting that the universe is a cosmogenesis, that it had a beginning, and that it is developing irreversibly towards some end. The question is, what kind of end? Teilhard wrote often of how the unitary perspectives offered by 20th century physics and biology have provided a decisive new impetus to our sense of the universe. The surge of modern pantheisms, he writes, is a result of this. But this impetus, he continues, will only end by plunging us back into supermatter if it does not lead to someone. So, I think pantheism is undoubtedly a beautiful affirmation of the enchanted wholeness of the universe. But I, like Teilhard, find it difficult to breathe in a universe without the involvement of divine transcendence. When I look at Western history through the lens of the evolution of consciousness, I see a movement through pre-modern mythic theism, where the universe is conceived of as being created by an entirely transcendent divine person, through a period of deism, and finally moving into a postmodern pantheism or atheism, which I lump together because both conceive of the universe in an entirely immanent and impersonal way. And I think the next step in this dialectic is toward an integral panentheism, where the universe is experienced as an ongoing process toward personalization, an anthropo-cosmogenesis, as Teilhard calls it. Teilhard articulates the subtle but important difference between pantheism and panentheism in the following way. He writes that if the reflective centers of the world are really one with God, this state is not obtained by identification, God becoming all as in pantheism, but by the differentiating and communicating action of love, where God is all in all. So God is not just one, but also many, not just transcendent, but living in the heart of each and every being. I think this dialectic from theism to atheism or pantheism to panentheism shows us that if history has any significance, it's that, as Owen Barfield says, in the course of it, the relation between creature and creator is being changed. Perhaps the God of our planetary age is no longer a hidden eye in the sky, uninvolved in earthly life. but in the course of the evolution of consciousness, beginning to take up far more intimate residence within and among us. As Teilhard writes, religion represents the long disclosure of God's being through the collective experiences of the whole of humanity. So, I'd like to draw attention to three reasons why I think a panentheist God remains relevant, even in our increasingly secular world. But to be clear, I'm not suggesting that God, as some sort of cultural symbol, has important social functions, and so should not be dispensed with. I'm not trying to make a prescriptive argument here. I'm suggesting that we come to terms with the fact that human beings will inevitably remain religious creatures for these reasons. Because of the nature of human community, because of our need for intimacy with the cosmos, and because consciousness, for its existence, depends on some evolutionary telos. So, first, community. Hegel seems to me to have been onto something in suggesting that divinity and humanity find their unity only in the consciousness of community. But the importance of God for community, and as we'll see, of community for God, was made apparent to me not at first by Hegel, but by the Jewish theologian Martin Buber. In the final lines of the afterword to this book, called I and Thou, Buber writes, "The existence of mutuality between God and humanity cannot be proved any more than the existence of God. Anyone who dares, nevertheless, to speak of it, bears witness and invokes the witness of those whom he addresses." End quote. Buber attempts in his book to articulate the twofold attitude that human beings can take toward the world and toward each other. The first is the I-it relation, wherein an aloof subject relates to the world and to others as objects, as means to its ends. The second is an I-thou or I-you relation, wherein one relates to other persons as the presence of God, or perhaps in the presence of God, encountering others as a revelation of the eternal you, of the universal person underlying the unique. Another Jewish thinker, influenced by Martin Buber, Levinas, finds God in the infinite responsibility that takes the ego hostage in any authentic face-to-face encounter with another. He writes, quote, "The free human being is dedicated to her fellow. No one can save herself without others. The inside-out domain of the soul does not close from the inside." So the soul is infinite. So it seems it cannot find wholeness without relating to divinity, which for Levinas is found in the holy transcendence of another's gaze. This notion of a soul unable to close from the inside also reminds me of something Teilhard questions when he asks why, quote, "we are not more sensitive to the presence of something on the move at the heart of us that is greater than ourselves." So an integral God would not only foster community, but would deepen the intimacy of our relationship to the cosmos. Teilhard's love of matter goes a long way in this direction, but I think the German shoemaker turned mystic Jakob Böhme's vision of the relationship between God and creation may have even more to say to us. The physicist Basarab Nicolescu, in his book Science, Meaning, and Evolution, distills the essence of Böhme's cosmology of divine self-manifestation as, quote, "a threefold structure leading to a sevenfold self-organization of reality." Now, I know that's a mouthful, but that's what this is for. So the first thing to keep in mind is that Böhme's God is not Aristotle's perfect, unmoved mover, but dynamic and self-revelatory by nature. Böhme wrote many books attempting to describe his epiphanic vision of a God who cannot but overflow into creation. So God in itself, the first box up here, the Trinity, is conceived traditionally as God the Father, though I think we could perhaps even more appropriately call it God the Mother. This is the abyss from which everything is born. It's the mysterious ground of pre-creation. And for Böhme, this ground consists of three principles existing in restless agitation: darkness, light, and fire, which he also calls sour, sweet, and bitter at other times. He's a very imaginative, evocative writer in this sense. Now, the light wants to expand and radiate, to become manifest. But the dark wants to remain hidden and self-contained. Which reminds me a lot of what Kelly was talking about the creative tension created by expansion and contraction, and also the same tension created by desire and fear. These opposites seem to be the tensions that give birth to creation. So, for Böhme, as a result of this internal friction produced by the self-contradiction between light and dark, God ignites into flames and burns in what Böhme calls a wheel of anguish. The fire of these three restless principles generates heat, which is the first of God's manifest qualities, but the fourth in the sevenfold self-organization of reality. This heat sparks a flash of light, which becomes the force of love in search of itself, the fifth principle. Love finds itself through the reverberation of sound or tone, language or word, which is the sixth principle. The word then becomes flesh, reaching fulfillment as body, God incarnate, which completes the sevenfold series. So for Böhme, the cosmos is the body of God. He at one point poetically refers to the stars as the fountain veins of God. Though I don't think this is just a metaphor. He means this quite literally. It's as if he's saying that the stars are a visible example of this sevenfold creator creativity in action. This sevenfold series can be understood in a Hegelian sense as moments in the self-development of the whole, a whole that begins where it ends, and that is already holographically present in each of its parts. Cosmogenesis is, for Böhme, the divine's attempt to find wholeness. And the human being participates in this attempt. Our faith, or our opening to the creative and imaginal dimensions of reality, acting as the food that nourishes God. Böhme's cosmology places heavy responsibility upon humanity, as the completion of this sevenfold cycle depends on our active cooperation. With the failure to consciously participate, according to Nicolescu, the entire universe of the creation would disappear into chaos. Owen Barfield has written a book called Saving the Appearances, which was his study in idolatry, a book about the evolution of consciousness. And I think it provides another way to deepen the intimacy of the bond between human beings and the universe. For Barfield, the entire history of the world consists in the changing relationship between consciousness and phenomena, or between spirit and matter. Long ago, human beings participated unconsciously in a spiritually imbued cosmos. But in time, with the gift of speech, the ability to name phenomena, came also an increasing awareness of self. Original participation, as Barfield calls it, with the cosmic process was gradually canceled, and human beings began to perceive only their own collective representations. The cosmos itself receded into the background. Following the scientific revolution, these collective representations became false idols, the universe conceived of as matter in motion without the need of being participated by any percipient beings, by any experiential creatures or entities. This further isolated human consciousness from a deterministic nature. As the 19th century approached its end, the universe began increasingly to seem like a collection of dead objects lacking all interiority, and the human being a fragile island of barely conscious intelligence. But this null point is not the end of the story. Barfield points to the possibility of final participation, wherein we come to recognize that our consciousness actively participates in the holotropic movement of space-time itself. In other words, we realize that we stand in what Barfield calls a directionally creator relation to the cosmos, that each of us are co-participants in the divine imagination continually bringing forth the phenomenal world. Final participation, according to Barfield, requires the reversal of our normal direction of consciousness. With original participation, the heart was fired from a source outside itself. Images or phenomena enliven the heart. But for final participation, the heart must be fired from within by its own spark of divinity. It is now for the heart to enliven the images. As Teilhard describes it so eloquently, lacking the metanoia required for final participation, quote, we are continually inclined to isolate ourselves from things and events surrounding us, as though we were looking at them from outside, as spectators rather than elements of what is happening. We are not being tossed about and drawn along in the vital current merely by the material surface of our being, but like a subtle fluid, space-time, having drowned our bodies, penetrates our soul, until the soul no longer knows how to distinguish space-time from its own thoughts. So, I hope we can see then that we are not mere spectators, as Teilhard says, of an already created universe, but rather that the telos of consciousness evolution is toward the activation of our latent powers of imaginal cognition, so that we might participate with God in the ongoing revelation of our universe. We'll close now with a quote by Böhme. He writes in his book, Aurora, "For thou needest not ask, where is God? Hearken, thou blind human. Thou livest in God, and God is in thee. And if thou livest holily, then therein thou thyself art God. For wheresoever thou lookest, there is God." Thank you. Off the hook, all right.
So, Matt? Couple of things. Yeah. A couple of things. So the first moment there of light, dark, and fire. So does that correspond to sweet, sour, and bitter?
Yes.
Or sweet, bitter, and sour?
Light is sweetness.
Yeah.
Darkness,
Darkness,
sour.
yeah. Fire, the raging fire, so bitterness, kind of clear.
So,
Would you want to limit the sense of that particular etymological derivation of the Hegel to the one that you, Jung and Boehme, others point to a less impressive, I think, and more fruitful reading of the root, that would link it to the notion of yoga, for instance, linking back or tying back together community, and so on. Whereas that was not the spin that we were giving it.
I guess I was a little worried about the sort of theological language that I was using, and wanted to acknowledge that I don't think religion, religious institutions, as we have inherited them traditionally, are really serving us at this point. Though I do think, when Gebser talks about preligion, it's not to sort of jettison the wisdom that's been inherited from the past. It's just to acknowledge the wholeness of time. There is a future, and that there is a constant re-emergence of the creativity of origin and present. And so if we become too fixated on the darkness, we'll bind us to the past, unable to see the possibilities that the future holds. So I think this word preligion, this concept that Gebser tries to develop, is just more appropriate to the direction I'm taking. Your point's well taken. And tradition is certainly important. I just think it's one component.
I guess I was not saying, I guess what I was wondering about was why limit the read, or what is getting tied back to tradition. My efforts will link it to reliance. So the linking is a reliance or interdependence, whether it's our interdependence of each and all of the community, or the cosmic, metacosmic interdependence or reliance between transcendence and so on. So I just, especially if you're wanting to reach, if you're planning earlier that we're not going to get rid of it, so all simple tradition is still active in the world and so on, it just might be a more strategic way, nothing else, than to try to get out of.
Yeah, you're right. I think I was thinking of the word only in a temporal sense and not considering that it binds us together.
I was just thinking about the integral God and maybe integral religion, but inherent in a lot of religions, or at least some major ones, is exclusivity. And so you have integration, but then there's exclusivity. And I'm thinking about the identity and difference. So I'm just thinking about that, how to integrate exclusivity into because it's one thing to say we welcome your Jesus, he's another Buddha or another avatar, but then the nature of a type of Christianity is that's the exclusive nature of it is that that's offensive and sacrilegious. So how would you offer a solution to that?
It's a really, really, really hard question. I think that there is something important about a move towards a sense of the transcendent divine as one. So monotheism in that sense. But I'm thinking of a quote by Owen Barfield, who says we need monotheism. What does he say? Monotheism of the spirit and a polytheism of imagination. Something along those lines. And I think that the reason some conception of God, and it's such a controversial word, the reason it's important is I think it allows us to recognize the underlying, perhaps not always visible, and so therefore apparently transcendent unity of the many. Not that there aren't many other spirits active. And so I think a monotheistic spirituality doesn't necessarily mean that no other spiritual powers are active in our world. Just sort of, it draws them all together in some sort of singularity that I personally find important. Again, it's a really hard problem, this issue of exclusivity, and I haven't fully worked it out. But I'm glad you brought it up.
Have you thought much about alternatives to the word God, given its charge and its tendency to invoke resistance?
Yeah. I don't know if you read the Buber quote that was on the screen. I should have read that out loud, but there's a sense in which this word is really burdened by that charge that you're talking about. But I don't think it's going to go away. And that's why I chose to use it rather than spirit or divinity. Just because I think, outside of this room, that word still speaks to a lot of people in a powerful way. And, even in this room, that there's that bit of tension or ambiguity as to what it really means. And I understand that, but I think I was looking to dive right into that tension. And to continue celebrating the power of this symbol, but I'm not particularly attached to it really. I think there really are no names, right? The eternal Tao is